And today's topic is the UN Climate Summit, currently convened in Paris. And we're asking, what do you think needs to happen in Paris as it comes to an end this week? To share your thoughts on the air, please call us, 415-663-8492. Well, these climate talks are called COP21. That stands for Conference of the Parties, meaning all the nations of the United Nations, and there's about 200 of them. And this is the 21st year. It's an annual meeting where in the past, they have had, like in 97, a Kyoto Protocol trying to deal with setting limits to our emissions. Of course, the U.S. refused to join that protocol then. And then another big one was in 2009 in Copenhagen, where the world came together. But, there was an agreement thrown together at the last minute with a lot of arm twisting and stuff. But in the end, it brought us nothing. And the intervening years where it's been in Durban and in Poland and in Cancun, they've always led up to saying Paris. This is the big one. This is when we're going to have the agreement that is going to solve this problem. We're going to put pressure. All the countries came forward. 150 countries came forward with their plans for what they were willing to do in terms of reducing emissions, mostly looking at the year 2030. Some countries looked at what they're going to do to preserve forests. Others came up with other actions. But then there are some countries who have no interest really in limiting their access to the oil in the ground that sustains their economies. So you have a diverse set of opinions. And of course, these are all voluntary now. And now we're trying to draft the text that is the agreement that has a preamble. And if something's in the preamble, that's not enforceable. And then it has kind of an appendix, an addendum. If it's in there, again, it's not enforceable. So for something to be what the countries can be held to account for, that's got to be in the body. And within the body, they still have lots of brackets for things that are still contested. These are issues that need to be resolved before sort of it's considered final, and then they ask the 200 nations to sign. And of course, there's a lot of jockeying for pressure. There's a lot of subtext. There's a lot of strategies and tactics. And so we'll talk about some of those today.
So what, apart from actual survival of nations and the population and people in the planet, what are the incentives for this agreement? Is there any kind of policing by any? I mean, is the UN going to actually have any power to hold, if they even come to an agreement that means something, to hold nations accountable?
It was the U.S., they claim, who insisted it be voluntary because our point in the administration is our Congress would never approve it. So unless we do voluntary, we can't get our country's government to agree to something anyway. So you're right. Voluntary is not enforceable. It's always down the road. It's kicking the can down the road.
Right.
It's really not biting the bullet and saying, this is the problem. And in fact, they're not getting anywhere close to identifying the problem.
The real problem.
The root problem. And that's kind of our job, is to help unroot some of those problems. So, Raven, what do you think is going on there in Paris right now?
Well, my gut feeling is it's a complete waste of time.
Well, it's dinner time. It would be lovely.
I think that, the end result is predictable. I saw the draft agreement this morning. It got sent to me through email. It's 29 pages. It's got lots of brackets, as you said, and dispute areas. One of them is whether we should have, the 2 degree. There's the 2 degrees versus the 1.5 degrees target. There's a disagreement about whether carbon emissions need to be cut 40 to 70% below 2010 levels, or 70 to 95%, or whether we need to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, the U.S., as you said, won't agree to anything unless the poorer countries agree not to sue the richer countries for climate damages. The word decarbonization is still in dispute, and the latest text contains no mention of emissions from the international aviation and shipping industries. And there's also very, very weak language, if any at all, on ecosystem protection, the rights of nature, the rights of indigenous people.
Let's unpack some of those, because you're going through a very long list.
No, we will.
You're
I'm
right.
just saying that's what I saw when I read it this morning. I was like, okay, gender inequality is still there, and there's a lot of human rights issues. And I think the end result is predictable, that the agreement won't be binding anyway. So what's the point? It's business as usual. And yeah.
Let's talk about that 2 degrees centigrade. That's been kicked around for a while as we must never go past that because it's impossible for humans and the ecosystem to survive 2 degrees. And that's 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, by the way. So we should not be fooled by the smaller number because it's centigrade. And just at this time, the 1.5 has come forward as more of a livable maximum. And I think the people who are putting that forward are correct about that. In other words, 2 degrees is really too much. But as I understand it, we're already at 0.8 degrees Celsius, having increased the temperature already. And we've set in motion something that is headed towards 4.5 degrees centigrade.
We already have runaway climate change.
Exactly. So if we do nothing, 5 degrees centigrade or 10 degrees Fahrenheit, let's say, is what we will suffer, and that's a burning up of ecosystems. There can be no more real human species survival at the large numbers that we have now. So this is urgent, and the word ambition is kicked around a lot in Paris, and I think it's the countries who are most likely to suffer the harsh effects of climate change first, like the Maldives Islands or the Marshall Islands. I mean, they're about to be flooded. They have no high ground to go to, so they disappear with sea level rise. The droughts in Africa, we saw all of these poor people trying to flee across the Mediterranean to get to Europe. They're fleeing climate change and terror, and same in Syria. I mean, Syria started with a drought where the people were protesting when Assad turned on his own people and the civil war started, but that was a trigger by climate change. So we've seen the effects of climate change already. This is not some future scary thing, but it's a current thing that needs to be addressed. It's just that a lot of people have felt like, what's bigger than the United Nations? It represents all of the people of the world coming together, except it doesn't necessarily represent all the people's interests, because it's the heads of nations that are maybe more inclined to care about what their funding sources come from, or whether their economies survive their next election cycle, as opposed to caring about future generations that we can give lofty speeches to. I mean, this bringing together of 200 world leaders is not insignificant, but then we saw the picture. What did that look like of the world leaders that were there?
Well, it was mostly men.
Yes, all these suits, right?
And it's big business and big government and the voice of civil society and the ordinary people and the indigenous people. And
yeah, the indigenous people are there, if they're lucky, as observers. They get a badge to go in, but they're not allowed to negotiate.
And they're sort of a quaint little sideshow for people to look at,
Yeah, but they're willing to question the whole purpose of this thing. But the capitalist system cannot be questioned within the negotiating room, right?
Or growth.
Yeah, the people that are doing the negotiating, they take as a given that we're going to have a capitalist system, and that economies must be protected at all costs. And I've seen articles that really upset me even on PBS. I was watching the News Hour, and they did a segment on the economic costs of climate change. It's like, this nuisance of climate change is really going to affect our economics here.
Our bottom line.
Yeah. I mean, how absurd. We don't have the fundamentals.
Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe it's vice versa. Maybe it's the bottom line that's affecting the climate.
That's not a maybe.
Give us a call if you have thoughts about this, if you have high hopes. Maybe maybe there's too much pessimism in this studio this morning. Let's, if you think it's a step in the right direction, that these guys are all meeting, give us a call, 415-663-8492.
Well, there is the attention by some of the media. A lot of the world media is there, so it's a forum for groups. This Women's Coalition on Earth and Climate Justice that is there. I saw Osprey Oriole Lake leading that women's organization.
It's the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network.
Exactly. Really powerful and really getting to root issues, bringing forth examples of women from countries that are already suffering climate change and talking in real terms, but they're not the negotiators. They're not being heard other than the media that's there. And I've like that Democracy Now! Amy Goodman is there, but on the mainstream media, what are they talking about? Trump and his stupid
The
ideas.
climate change deniers.
It's
What happened to the deniers? We're not seeing any protests from them saying, "Oh, this is all bunkum and don't waste your time." Or have we heard anything about that? We haven't heard anything about climate change.
But the Republicans have rallied in the Congress such that we all know that there's no chance in heck that they would ever pass an agreement that would address the issue in a serious way.
If you're a climate change denier, call 415-663-8492. Let us know why it doesn't really matter what happens in Paris.
Well, I read an interesting point about going back to the French Revolution. You know that part of what kicked that off is there had been a volcano that had set up all the sediment and caused the climate to get cooler, and there was a grain shortage in France. So bread, which was a staple for the French people, was in short supply. You know, that led to that stupid comment by...
Let them eat cake.
Exactly. So they didn't understand the problem. But it's ironic that we're back in Paris where we had to have that revolution. And it's almost like maybe it's time for the guillotine again. But right now, the people in charge in Paris, what happened to the demonstrations?
Well, that's exactly right. Well, I think it was all very convenient, and call me a conspiracy theorist or a suspicious mind, but, you know, that Paris was attacked by terrorists just before COP21, when I happened to know that was, you know, we had planned activism across the world, the largest civil disobedience ever in the history of humankind. And then suddenly a state of emergency was declared, which led to the house arrests of various key climate activists, some of whom I know, along with a ban of public assemblies and protests, but of course not Christmas gatherings or football gatherings, just protests and dissent against climate action.
People's voices.
Yeah, and then a massive increase in armed security guards just for these 2 weeks. I mean, I can't remember how many thousands of police are there, but it's military police, and they're quite aggressive. I mean...
They're taking media people and just peacefully people with a sign are being taken out in paddy wagons.
But that's any kind of opposition has been crushed. So that's been quite depressing.
Seems like if you were a terrorist and you wanted to make a big splash, you'd wait until everyone was there, wouldn't you?
Yes.
Doing it 2 weeks beforehand? Anyway.
Anyway.
I don't know if that was a false flag or not, but when you go back earlier in the year when the Charlie Hebdo massacre happened, that was a terrorist attack. And what did the government say? They said, come out in the streets and protest. So we're getting two different responses to, well, this bigger one, the second one was bigger, but still, I think there is a need to try to protect these climate talks and not distract from their supposed legitimacy.
Let's read a couple of these activist stories, if you don't mind. One is that there thousands of empty shoes were placed in Paris Square, where the largest disobedience was planned, and even the Pope sent a pair of shoes.
That was a powerful picture.
Pretty powerful statement.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, Edward Willey, who's Coast Miwok, wrote on my Facebook, didn't he? That about sums it up. Looking at those empty shoes on a. Anyway,
he's Pomo.
Sorry, Pomo, and I think he has Coast Mule. Anyway, he's not here. Call in if you're listening and correct me.
415-663-8492.
And then there's been various other installations and actions, like the 12 melting icebergs from Greenland. Did you see those? Those were arranged in the shape of a clock at the Pantheon. And then some activists have plastered the faces of climate criminals around Paris on walls and billboards. And then still others placed thousands.
What were the images of
I don't have the climate criminals. They're climate deniers, people who are invested in making a profit from
like Koch brothers or
that kind of thing. Yeah,
but not Obama. Or
I don't think Obama was up there. No, these were specific business leaders that were also undermining the science behind climate change. And then there was some activists did sort of an Adbusters style guerrilla art activist project by putting thousands of posters that look like authentic companies. Did you see those?
Yeah,
the
brilliant.
VW and
That was
the
brilliant.
airline companies, but basically were subversions of those advertisements. Those were very funny and clever. And then, there was thousands of demonstrators that created a human chain along the route of the planned march last Saturday. But this unfortunately led to a violent clash with the police, and they were using tear gas and sound bombs and
Wait, the protesters were using tear
no,
gas?
the police. The police. And they were boshing people over the head. Of course,
Yeah.
we didn't get much media coverage of that. You have to really dig for it.
Right.
But over 200 people were put in prison. And anyway, but that was part of a larger global climate protest that took place across the globe with over 600,000 people in 175 countries. And I think the strong message that these activists are saying is that, we have to continue to speak out against these false solutions, greenwash corporations, and the capitalist economic system that's killing the planet. There is a plan for 12/12 at 12, that's December the 12th at 12 p.m., coming up for a big civil disobedience in Paris against the law. So
That's this Saturday.
That's this Saturday.
So that's
And
noon Paris time?
yeah, noon Paris time. And I hope it takes place. Naomi Klein is really calling hard for it.
That would be...
I think it might be noon
4 in the
everywhere.
morning.
In other words, there are protests here in California.
Are
that'll
there? I don't know.
Yeah, I do know that.
It would have to be a revolving... Yeah.
In
Yeah,
any case,
yeah.
we'll see what happens. Indigenous people have also been taking a stand, paddling down the Seine in canoes and things, and calling on the government to include the indigenous rights in the climate agreement.
Yeah, at the beginning, the world leaders came in early this time. It's a 2-week conference that's going to end tomorrow or Saturday.
Right.
And at the start, we had Obama and other world leaders there for their photo ops and to give their lofty speeches. And these speeches are all hollow because they really are trying to have their cake and eat it too. We talked about let them eat cake. There's still this notion that we can continue our economic system. We can continue with economic growth. All we have to do is trade out these fossil fuels over time for these newer technologies like the renewables, and then, of course, things that have been a fantasy like clean coal counts on this thing called carbon sequestration, so that we can pump that carbon out of the air, we can suck it out of the air. Well, that requires incredible energy to do in the first place, and it's never been proven. And there's this belief that many people have that somehow the technology will come through. We don't have to worry because we're in an ingenious species, and with all the marvelous brain power that we have and the scientific knowledge we have, surely someone will come up with a solution and save us at the last minute.
Richard Heinberg calls those the techno fixers.
Yes, and they're false solutions. I remember many years ago, we were dealing with false solutions. People were saying, there's plenty of oil. Look at the tar sands in Alberta. That was a solution. And then nuclear has been always put out there as a solution.
Yeah, nuclear.
Yeah, but there are some real solutions that are hinted at now, like industrial animal agriculture. Vegan people are very strongly organized, saying, indeed, how in that case, 30% of the greenhouse gases comes from the raising of livestock in our industrial methods. 45% of the land is taken, and most of the destruction of rainforest is in order to allow cattle and grazing. Now, there's something to be said for better agricultural methods, indeed, sequestering naturally carbon into the soil. So better methods, but they're not industrial scale methods. They're not these kinds of ag business. That they are the permaculture solutions, the local farming solutions.
Localization, family farms can feed the world and have been, and big ag and big everything else, big chem, big pharma, big oil. It's all about growth, and as much product as possible. And if you have to throw half of it away, that's fine. It's incredibly wasteful and destructive. Anyway.
Well, I want to say that Rob Hopkins, who's the founder of the International Transition Movement, the Transition Network, of which I was involved with for many years, he actually went inside to the COP21, COP21. Sorry, expressing my bias here. But he had a book printed through the Transition Network, which was called 21 Stories for Transition. And in that, I don't know if you saw that, but it was really inspiring. It was just people on the ground, permaculturists, people taking action, doing local currencies, relocalizing their food systems, and, taking sound steps towards low carb, powering down, basically, creating their own low carbon economies and resilient communities. And that was inspiring. I don't know who saw it at COP21, but I know that he presented there. So
that powering down theme has been missing. No one's talking about less. Everyone's talking about continuing our current levels. Status quo industrial civilization by these technological means. But no one's recognizing that the real need has to be learning to live on less energy, on less stuff. And clearly we've done it in the past. We can do it. I mean, there was human life before the Industrial Revolution. And
yes.
Before plastic, I think.
You guys should remember that. You're getting old.
Well, I do remember thinking that wasn't it great that I was part of the generation that could feed the world, and we were all going to raise everybody's standard of living to new heights? And I certainly bought into that American dream, and so have people all over the world. I mean, now we're fighting with the money about how to sort of funnel money from the developed rich countries to the poorer countries so they don't use coal to try to get their industrial revolution going, so that they can skip over and go right to green technologies. But we don't question whether those green technologies are indeed scalable to the level of what industrial civilization is demanding in energy these days.
Yes. Well, somebody must have an opinion out there. I find it hard to believe that people aren't
No one cares.
Interested
UN
in
climate, big deal.
I mean, one of the things is it hasn't been getting a lot of media coverage. People are probably more interested in Trump if we were talking about him. But I'm surprised.
And the war.
And the war.
All the wars that are going on. We've got to talk about that. So, yes, 415-663-8492. Give us a call. Just call us up and say hi. And whether what you think is going to happen. Is there going to be an agreement? Will it be any use at all? And what are you doing? What are you doing for climate change? What are you doing to counter climate change in your own life? How about that? Let's have a little summit right here in West Marin instead of in Paris.
There's a component of the agreement called loss and damage. It's also called finance for the developing countries. And the idea is that we pay into a fund, and that fund has been suggested at $100 billion, which many people say is a drop in the bucket for the world. I mean, it sounds like a lot of money. The U.S., John Kerry this morning apparently said, we're doubling our contribution from $430 million to $860 million. Other people said, well, we had in mind $860 million all along, and this is just a way to get a positive press release. But some people say that our responsibility is at least 5 times that much, because we are the beneficiaries of the carbon that's in the atmosphere. We have all burned the fuels, the fossil fuels that have created this problem to enhance our lives, to enhance our economics. And now we should take responsibility for what's out there. But instead, what we do is we don't even want it based on consumption. We want it based on where the energy is used. And of course, we all know that in the United States, manufacturing, for the most part, has been outsourced to Central and South America, to Asia, to places where people will work cheaply. But also, then that's where the energy gets used to manufacture the products. So that's embodied energy, and it's embodied emissions that then when they come to our shores, we reap the benefits of.
Exactly.
But we're not being asked to pay for that.
Right. And that's part of the push against any kind of change by corporations. They say, well, yeah, sure, we can make emissions control here, but look at China.
Yeah.
And who is China making stuff for? What are those emissions for? They're for us. That's so that we can maintain our pampered little lives here in the U.S. of A.
Well, what about the military, Raven? You know something about that?
Oh, well, I was just reading about the military because I didn't know, but the military emissions are not counted in the official UN climate statistics due to lobbying by the United States. And yet the US's military establishment is the single largest subnational consumer of fossil fuels on the planet. It has $1 trillion per year military budget. So it's hard to imagine how the U.S. government's going to subsidize the transition to a carbon-free electricity, agriculture, manufacturing and transportation, etc., without tapping into that.
Yes.
$3 trillion.
Carbon
Shocking.
footprint of war. It's a wonderful thing.
So I read an article online called it the carbon bootprint of the U.S. military.
That's a good point.
And yes, of course, there's the carbon footprint, there's the depleted uranium footprint, there's the the leftover stuff that we leave everywhere during wars. And we have a caller.
Hello, caller. Welcome to Let's Talk on KWMR. You're on the air. What's your first name?
My first name is Murray.
Oh, hi, Murray.
Hi, Murray.
Hello.
Thanks for calling.
Great show.
Thank you.
I have two thoughts. One especially is the idea of technology or engineers solving the problem. I think I've got the sense that you think that's not going to happen, but for me, and I'm not an engineer, so I can't speak from that perspective. But I've lived through so many miracles. I can remember when television came into our lives. That it seems hard for me to shake the idea that engineering won't solve the problem. So that's one thing. That's just sort of always with me, that somebody will come up, some guy in a garage someplace is going to come up with an answer.
May I comment on that, Murray? And I want to hear your second point as well.
Sure.
When you're talking about engineering, you're talking about this technological advanced civilization that we've created. And that's using power. It's using energy. Now, energy and technology are different things, right?
Right.
And a lot of technology is about using the energy we have more efficiently. So you're right to have hope that we can continue with our technological genius to keep using energy more efficiently. But technology can't really replace energy, can it?
No. But I'm saying let's just supposing that they could just pick a number. They could cut down the amount of energy we need in cars and heating and whatever in half in some fashion. I'm not saying it's a gadget exactly, but what would happen then? Just through ingenuity. Maybe it's how people wear clothes inside in the winter that their bodies keep them warm. I don't know what the invention would be. I'm just saying it's hard for me to give up the idea that we're not going to sort of think our way out of the problem.
Well, that's the path we're definitely on. I mean, when people 10 years ago bought Priuses and now are buying Teslas and they're putting solar on their roof, that's all in that mode. It's saying we can continue to live our lifestyle if we just do better at managing the energy that's consumed.
Yep, and I might, part of my brain believes that we can believe things that are myths. I mean, a lot of people on the planet believe things that are probably not true, and that may be one of them. I'm just saying that it is fixed deep into my consciousness, and I'm sure I'm not the only person who feels that I don't have to worry because, somebody a lot smarter than me is going to figure it out.
I hear you, and I want to have that hope too. But I mean, all technology as it stands in our capitalist economy is based on extraction and the drawdown of natural resources, not to mention the pollution and poisoning that's involved in that, and not to mention the corporatization and the consolidation of power in the hands of a few at the expense of the marginalized and the many. And that's the real problem with these technological solutions. So, for example, you have the Breakthrough Energy Coalition that was launched by billionaire Microsoft founder Bill Gates at COP21, linked to the Mission Innovation Initiative, which is a government project that also was launched at COP21. And the idea is to harness the funds to accelerate the clean energy revolution, which is great if it really is going into innovation. But if you look closely into it, you'll see that the aim is actually to grow the profits of the investors, in particularly Bill Gates. And the focus is almost entirely on nuclear energy. And surprise, surprise, Bill Gates is also the founder and chairman of TerraPower, which is one of the fastest growing nuclear energy companies on the planet.
Yeah, well, as I say, this isn't based on a careful study. It's a feeling.
Yeah.
I mean, the World's Fair and, flying cars.
Yes.
And
We've all grown up in generations in which it's been this incredible leap in technological innovation, and it's the wonders
so
of
anyhow, I know that Bernie has talked to me. Sometimes we have some advantages here, and the costs, as you just said now about the manufacturing put someplace else, or we get our electricity, but I don't know where the power plant is. I don't see it. It's not in Inverness as far as I can see. So I think a lot of stuff is hidden. The other thing that strikes me is two other thoughts. One has to do with population. That I'll just say that if we had a small population on the planet, the problems would be less. But the other is about giving up. When I was a kid, giving up stuff. When I was a kid in Cleveland, we once had 10 days in a row that were 100 degrees with high humidity, and we did not have air conditioning. And a big deal was we got a little fan, which we crouched down in front of. But we didn't have any electricity and no air conditioning. But now people think it's unthinkable in tough climates like Florida, where I also lived, to go without air conditioning and lots of other things. The first few years of my life, we didn't have a car. My dad walked a mile to a bus.
Right.
We were sort of lower middle class. He had a nice job, we had a house, and no car. And now families have many cars. And what I don't see is a lot of people willing to go back to the 50s or the whatever you want to.
Not voluntarily.
People love, people love their stuff, and
Yes.
I'm one of those people. So I have a friend who says people will give up the stuff when they have to.
Right.
When I plug in my iPhone and there's no juice for it, then I'll use, paper and abacus, or or we'll sing our own songs. So I wonder what you think about that. There seems to me something so strong in people.
Murray, you've raised some really good points, and you speak for a lot of people. It's ingrained in our culture, no question, and thank you for bringing that out. Okay. We have to do a quick station break, and then we'll go back to discussing what you brought up.
Okay, thanks a lot for your show. It's terrific.
Yeah, please listen in.
Thank you.
Thank you, Murray.
Well, let's go back to a point that Murray raised, is how in his gut he has a sense that we will solve this problem. That kind of hope is endemic in our spirit.
Of course.
And our politics, we know it plays to our fears when it comes to, police funding and military and all that. But I think they also play to our hopes. I think there is an industry now. We know that the fossil fuel industry, people have recognized, is part of the problem. So the 350.org divest stocks that are in the fossil fuel industry, that's a program that people understand the target to. But then the green renewable energy industry is also an industry, and it likes to play to our hopes that yes, we can drive this forward. And there is a nonstop news feed that I see that says, there's enough sun in the desert to power the world. There's always this idea that don't worry, there's enough solar power. All we have to do is have the political will. But those don't look at really what the physics of it are. They pretend that with a political decision, we can have our cake and eat it too. And the problem is at a physics level. It's not at a political level.
We have another caller. Hello, caller. Welcome to Let's Talk on KWMR. You're on the air. What's your first name?
Fred.
Oh, hi, Fred.
Fred.
Yeah, Fred from Marshall. I recently watched Cowspiracy on Netflix, and I was shocked to find out how much pollution is caused by pasture animals versus fossil fuel consumption. And I want to give a shout out to Albert Strauss for coming up with an innovative solution to methane.
Capturing the methane, yeah.
And apparently he takes the cow pies and puts them in a pond and has a plastic cover over it and collects the methane to run generators, which is very clean-burning fuel. And then he produces electricity, and he has vehicles that run on electric.
Yes.
And he runs his milking machines that way. I know he originally did it because of the deregulation of electricity in California and trying to avoid being ripped off by Enron and Duke Energy. And so he saved a lot of money that way, too. So I see this as a win-win solution to agribusiness.
You're absolutely right. It's the local farming that employs the organic techniques or the permaculture principles that is the way to turn away from this industrial form of agriculture that is indeed causing huge amounts of pollution. The dead zones at the mouths of rivers is primarily caused by the runoff from animal agriculture.
Feedlots, yeah.
Yeah, and so you're so right that there are examples for how to do it correctly. Unfortunately, that's not getting a lot of play in Paris right now.
Well, actually, the Cowspiracy pointed out that the politicians won't even touch it because of the lobbyists. For the agribusiness in the United States is so powerful that they don't want to touch it.
Yeah. Well, see, everything being centralized with our government and then being funded by those big corporations with lots of PR money, they're able to affect our definitions even of what is organic. They're able to decide who gets the money handouts, who gets the welfare, and some of them are even farmers themselves that are voting themselves the money. It's never going to the small local farmer, really. Boy, that's a great point, Fred. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fred.
Thank you, Fred.
Yeah, so we know there are solutions, but, and we hinted about this before, so much of the solution has to be us being to live a lot more modestly.
Simplification, right? I mean,
because complexity in itself requires energy. And you know, it's been shown by some researchers that past civilizations that have crashed, just before they do, there's this huge flurry to ever increase efficiency, to do ever more, and that raises complexity, and it actually makes the problem worse. So it heads for a bigger Mad Max type of crash than you would have if we weren't trying these desperate measures to keep a failing model alive.
And most of the old empires that have crashed created their own sort of localized climate change, where there's either desertification or they killed all the trees or whatever. They destroyed their farming lands, and so it resulted in collapse of empire and mass migrations. But
this is on a global scale, isn't it?
And
it's
now
much
it's
more
on
massive.
a global scale, yeah.
It's everybody
because we've grown so much.
But we can watch it in other species. If you have deer on an island, there's a tendency for them to overeat the plant life there and grow in numbers until they do. Then there has to be a dieback till sort of nature finds that balance where the right number of deer will ultimately be on that island based on the plant life that can sustain them. So we humans want to manage that, but nature does require that when people overconsume their resources, there's a die-off. And some people don't want to address that issue. I mean, we know that the population, the 7 billion, would all like to live like us. We know it's already, we're in an overshoot situation already, so there's no way in heck that all people could live like us. We don't want to live like them. So how do we get the numbers down? And unfortunately, the nature will find ways to bring the numbers down.
But the thing that really concerns me is climate justice, that the people who are being the hardest hit right now and are dying and are losing their livelihoods and their lands and their children to, not just to the climate change, but the diseases and other things that rise up about that they're not us. They're not us sitting in West Marin, and that's a big problem. I think that we have to get involved in this fight with the indigenous people, with the marginalized people. And for me, I want to be the voice for nature. And there's a couple of things that are missing from COP21, and one of them is the oceans. And Sylvia Earle, who's one of my heroines, went to COP21 and she said, what about the oceans? They cover 71% of the earth. They contain 97% of its water. They produce 50 to 70% of all the oxygen that we breathe. And yet, protecting, conserving and cleaning up the oceans isn't anywhere on the agenda for COP21. She calls it the big blue elephant in the room. Everyone knows the ocean is essential. No one's taking action. And so she went there to Paris to put world leaders on notice that if you neglect this force that drives drives climate and weather, shapes planetary chemistry, it's the principal governing body of planetary temperature, then, efforts here at Paris are going to fail. No ocean, no life, no ocean, no us, no nothing.
Exactly. We're the water planet.
We need the holistic view. That's been a problem I've had with 350.org. I was a big supporter of them initially, but if you define the problem as CO2 in the atmosphere, I asked my progressive friends that let's say we could manage to engineer our way back to 350 parts per million. Would we now be out of the woods? No, because all of the other parts of the planet we're destroying are still under attack. So it isn't just about the climate. The climate is the latest, greatest symptom, that it's a symptom that can overwhelm us all. But the root problems are much more fundamental.
Sure.
And let's name it. I mean, it comes down to capitalism. It comes down to private property ownership.
It's huge industry.
Yeah, well, it's all of us participating in that. We are the beneficiaries of this system that takes from other parts of the globe those resources, and we promise those people through the World Bank that it's going to do good for their economy. It never does. It leaves them even in worse conditions usually. Look at Nigeria with the oil there. I mean, it's a disaster, even though there are billions being made by shareholders of those oil companies.
Right, yeah. And the oceans, of course, have always been the dumping ground, right? I mean, especially for the nuclear industry. Witness Fukushima, right? Oh, we'll just dump it in the ocean. It'll be fine. And, the more nukes, the more nuclear waste in the ocean and elsewhere.
Why isn't anybody talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, which, if people don't know, is it's a very secretive free trade agreement that extends the global rights of corporations, undermines democracy, and it's being pushed through Congress now, isn't it? And I don't see
that will
in the
trump
news.
Anything that is in a voluntary treaty in Paris. So it's like the economy is always considered the more important issue because it's the most immediate, and we have election cycles.
So what you're saying is even if we set carbon emissions as the U.S., that under the TPP, corporations can sue the U.S. government.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Well, because we're not obligated. If we were obligated, I understand it would be different. But we, as the U.S., have been twisting arms there to get it to where it's only going to be voluntary contributions. And who's going to monitor those? I mean, we were talking about that before. Does the UN really have any way to come back and say, you, Europe, and you, the United States, you're not on track to meet your targets?
So it feels like what we're concluding here is that the Paris talks are just a big show, and it doesn't matter what comes out of there, that all it was a great way for everyone to get together and make trade deals, probably, that there's not going to be any benefit. Should we just stop? Let's just say no COP22. Forget it. Let's do something else. Let's try something else.
This is what Tom Goldtooth says, the executive director of the Indigenous Environmental Network. Indigenous voices are being silenced there in Paris, and that, they're on the front lines of climate change, and yet their rights are being ignored. Quote, "We are here in Paris to tell the world that not only will the anticipated Paris Accord not address climate change, it will make it worse because it will promote false solutions and not keep fossil fuels from being extracted and burned. The Paris COP21 is not about reaching a legally binding agreement on cutting greenhouse gases. In fact, the Paris Accord may turn out to be a crime against humanity and Mother Earth." And by the way, Naomi Klein also says the deal that will be unveiled in less than a week will not be enough to keep us safe. In fact, it will be extraordinarily dangerous.
I agree that it's dangerous when it gives the sense that we're on some kind of a track to solving this problem when we haven't even gotten to the root problem. We can't even talk about what is the underlying problem. So example of some of the arm twisting that's going on there is that in the wording for gender equality, Saudi Arabia doesn't want that. But what they do want is occupied people having voice like the Palestinians. So the United States kind of wants the opposite. So we make a deal with them is let's not do either gender equality or occupied people, because we want Israel and the United States not to have to veto this agreement. We have to be for it. So it's the same kind of trading that goes on, every day. And you're right. This is kabuki theater, because it's trying to say to the world, because they feel the pressure from below. There's no question that our leaders feel this pressure, but this is a way of pretending to be for it. And I got to say that in our presidential politics for 2016, I don't see this being a big enough issue either. I mean, we know the Republicans are all in denial, but even between Bernie and Hillary Clinton, there's sort of lip service to it, much the way Obama talked when he went there to say what we must do. But neither of them or none of the candidates are really saying maybe it's time we ended our economic system and we stopped trying to grow our economy. I mean, can you imagine a political leader saying that? No, but we can imagine them saying no more people of a certain religious faith allowed into our country.
Yeah. Even citizens. Oh man, don't get me started. So what? Where is COP22 being held? Do we know? Should it? Why don't they hold it on like the Marshall Islands? Why don't they go out to somewhere that's going to be inundated in the next 20 years and hold it there and see?
Well,
get firsthand what's going on.
I don't know where COP22
I don't either.
Is that even on the table?
No.
Interesting.
But something that Amy
Good
Goodman
idea.
brought out is that I remember a couple of years back, we had some passionate speakers. I remember some young people speaking. I remember the representative from the Philippines talking about a monsoon that was hitting the Philippine Islands just as it was going. It was killing thousands, if not tens of thousands of people, in a very impassioned speech. He's been pushed aside by the government. And so there's been a lot of leaders who in past have tried to speak up who aren't there the second time there's a meeting, because there are powerful forces behind there. And I'm sure the United States is a big part of that say to those countries, if you want the continued economic or military aid or whatever, you're not going to have that person come and embarrass us all in front of the world.
And yet, I sort of made a tongue-in-cheek thing about we're all worried about sea level rise here and property, our property going underwater. And I sort of said, well, why don't we put a flood dam across the mouth of Tamales Bay, like the Thames River flood barrier? And we got I got a reply on how much that would cost. And
oh, really?
And of course, there is the thing that there's a fault line right down the middle of it, and
there is
one
that.
side of it is moving north. But I saw this morning that there's actually there's a Spanish organization that is pushing for a bridge and a dam across the Straits of Gibraltar.
Really?
This is how, these are the fixes, the techno fixes that we're looking at for climate change and sea level rise. Oh, we'll just dam it all off. It'll be fine.
So it's much more sinister than that. There's this thing called REDD, which I know. I don't know if you know about that. REDD.
Yep.
And it stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. It's a United Nations carbon offset mechanism that uses forest, agriculture, and other ecosystems basically as sponges for northern industrialized countries' pollution instead of reducing the emissions at the source. The indigenous people call it REDD, reaping profits from evictions, land grabs, deforestation, and destruction of biodiversity. It's pure greenwash, and it's terrifying, really.
It is, and all these cap and trade systems always start with, well, given where we are now or where we were in 2000, we're going to set our targets based on that. It doesn't start with everyone is equal, and so there's some people have called this carbon colonialism.
Yes, I've heard that.
And in a way, we continue to practice that. And really, I think the UN is a tool for us to, just like the World Bank is a tool for U.S. corporations to get access to other people's lands
just like
and
the
resources.
TPP. The TPP is part of that.
Exactly. So, we have put our faith in our leaders, and that's what's misplaced. And I think more and more people are recognizing that. I think the crazy politics that we're hearing in this country, part of it is recognizing that we are powerless as people.
Off with their heads.
Yeah. So a large number of people respond to fascist-type speech that points the finger at a certain group.
Because he's speaking his mind. However crazy his mind is, at least he's speaking his mind, so that's better than what we're getting.
Well, we always like pointing the finger, and a lot of finger-pointing goes on at the UN. We love to say it's India and China we got to worry about. Take the heat off of us. And of course, the rest of the world knows that we are the greatest emitters of all time. And if we really wanted to lead the world, we need to lead by example. We don't really need to go to the UN. We could, in this country, shut down all nuclear plants over the next 5 years. We could decide to not build any more coal, not allow any more coal mining. We could put the kibosh on all those things. But the truth is, we the people don't want that. I think, when people point the finger at the Koch brothers and the suppliers, they need to take a look at us, the people who demand it, because truly we would not vote for someone who would cut us off from our lifestyles, who would say, give us the truth. So we want to pretend as much as our negotiators are pretending for us.
It's always someone else's fault. It's not us. It wasn't me. I didn't really want that other car.
Are you saying that supply creates demand? Because I think, are you saying demand creates supply?
Well, I think they're mutual. And so right now we have a glut of gas because of fracking, and the OPEC have stopped putting restrictions on themselves. So there's this huge supply of oil on the world market. The price is down. Part of that is trying to push some countries out of the business of oil production. We know that can't last. Eventually that'll go. But while it's down, it's spurring the economy. So people are believing that we're in a recovery mode here in this country. Things will be well. We will all go back to full employment and having the life that we've all been promised. And if it were shut down, the price would skyrocket. We could not have all the things, and we would go crazy. We would start telling our political leaders that price gouging that's happening, you need to look into that. And you got to keep our gasoline price where we can afford it. We demand fossil fuels.
Cheap
we like to
fossil
pretend
fuel,
that we don't, but we're addicted to it, and it's understandable why. I mean, it's the most powerful thing that humans have ever discovered. Of all the minerals, the gold used to be the really big thing, but this black gold has been incredible, and it's been responsible for this technological revolution that we've all so enjoyed.
I haven't enjoyed it, though. I mean, it might be you. I'd like to see some more women in leadership roles in other marginalized communities, because I don't know that that's
and that's why some groups there are indeed pushing for more gender equality being in the text of the agreement, because they recognize that the patriarchy is part of what is keeping the capitalist system afloat. More women do recognize, and more women are affected by the effects. Yes. We know that they are the small farmers. They're the ones that are responsible, for the most part, getting food on the table, bringing water to the table. And so women are suffering more than men are, other than these men who leave to try to get employment elsewhere and become refugees and try to send home money. And it's a really sad state of affairs that our human population has evolved into.
So winding up, what would you say about Paris?
Who are you asking?
Well, either of you. What's the conclusion of this show? Do we care what
We're
they
doomed.
decide in
That's
Paris?
my 2 words. Your turn, Bernie.
Well, it's at least a time where we get to talk about this subject and to get some focus on it. So I do look forward to huge demonstrations. I look forward to us all resisting more. And I want to thank our listeners today and our 2 callers today for having the courage to call us and participate. And I hope you'll tune in every Thursday at 11, because your voice really does matter.